Okay, thank you all so much for coming. Good morning. I'm going to introduce Tanzil Chowdhury. He's an assistant professor in public law. He's currently a senior fellow at the Racial Justice Project at New York Law School and a visiting scholar at the New School. He authored the book Time, Temporality, and Legal Judgment, and recently co-authored the book Abolishing the Police. Tanzil was also the co-founder of the Northern Police Monitoring Project and helped set up the Greater Manchester Law Centre. His research broadly looks at public law, race, and primitive accumulation. And the paper he's going to present today is titled Constitutional Robbery, UK Public Laws Regimes of Dispossession and Racialization in the Chagos Archipelago, in which he offers a reconsideration of the British expulsion of the Chagosian in the 60s and 70s to make way for a US military base. Tanzil, over to you.
Thank you, Loana. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope that everyone can see that.
Yeah, we can see that.
Fantastic. So first of all, I'd also like to just kind of echo Gabby's thanks to everyone, Savannah, also Gabby herself, and fantastic friends / colleagues who are also visitors here at the new school. And also it's a pleasure to share this panel with Loana Diep. So this is quite a detailed paper, so I'm only going to explore the general claims, though I'm happy to take up detail in either the Q&A or at the in-person coffee or via email. So some of you may know about the Chagos Archipelago or the British Indian Ocean Territory, or it's also known as Diego Garcia, which is the name of one of the islands in the archipelago. But, and please forgive me, I'm going to assume a veil of ignorance and presume that people don't know much about the dispossession of the Chagos Archipelago, which is no thanks to a deliberate attempt by the governments of the US and the UK. So let's start with a very truncated and social and political history. So the Chagos Archipelago, which is at the bottom right of the slide, is a remote set of islands and islets located in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So the nearest country is the Maldives to the north, which is about 310 miles. And then you have the south of India and Sri Lanka to the northwest, and to the east, Mauritius, Seychelles, and East Africa. It was first settled by the French in 1783, who established slave plantations that exploited coconuts to mainly make oil. The first settlers were enslaved Creole people from the Isle of France, which was the French colonial name for Mauritius, as well as Madagascar and Mozambique. Around the period of abolition, you also have the importation of indentured labor from India. Unusually for plantation economies as well, rather than supplying European markets with oil, the Chagos Archipelago actually serviced the rest of the colony of Mauritius. So Chagos was, in effect, a colony of a colony. In 1814, the colony of Mauritius, of which the Chagos is a part, was ceded to the British through the Treaty of Paris, following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. By the turn of the 20th century, most Chagosians, as they are known, worked on the copra plantations and were provided with a wage, fixed rations, pensions, free passage to neighbouring Mauritius, burial services, healthcare, etc. Workers also received a small parcel of land near their homes where they cultivated livestock and arable farming, primarily for subsistence, and it's safe to say that they firmly established themselves as a community. Now, during the Cold War, some pretty awful things began to happen to the Chagosians. An infamous policy, US policy rather, called the Strategic Islands Concept, was established in which the American government would set up military bases in strategically located, lightly populated, isolated islands, still controlled by friendly Western powers. Now, the anxiety that provoked the policy was that emergent post-colonial governments, so this was during the era of formal decolonization, would likely be hostile to the presence of US naval bases on the territory. And in light of the US's anti-communist containment policy, prone to Soviet influence. Now, at the time, especially in the Indian Ocean region, you also have the flow of oil in the Persian Gulf and a power vacuum in the region following the British defeat in the Suez Canal in 1952. The US picked Diego Garcia as a prime location for a new Indian Ocean military base, one of the islands in the Chagos archipelago. Now, the British were open to the idea, but the problem, and I use that term euphemistically for both governments, was that there was a permanent population on the archipelago. Or, to quote Dennis Greenhill, who worked at the British Colonial Office at the time, unfortunately, along with the birds go some few Tarzans or Men Fridays, end quote. And recall that as a colony, Mauritius, of which the Chagos was a part, was also calling for independence. Through a series of secrets, obfuscations, and lies, the details of which are explained elsewhere at length, the British government would claim the Chagosians were a floating population of temporary contract labourers from Mauritius, rather than a community that had lived there for 200 years. Now, without going into detail, the British ended up introducing a series of legal instruments that cut off and dispossessed the Chagosians from their homeland. The first legal instrument was to effectively tear the Chagos archipelago from the colony of Mauritius, so that when Mauritius became independent, the Chagos would remain under British sovereignty. It's also important to note here that the UK effectively blackmailed the future Mauritian government to go along with these terms, which interestingly have been the basis of litigation at the International Court of Justice. The new excised territory was renamed the British Indian Ocean Territory. The UK then enacted another series of legal instruments which dispossessed the Chagosians from their homeland over a period of 6 years, so that a military base could be constructed on Diego Garcia. Many Chagosians were left stranded, destitute, and deeply traumatized by the events on the shores of Mauritius, the Seychelles, and even London Gatwick Airport in the UK, which is why there is such a large minority of Chagosians in the nearest town to the airport, Crawley. Today, the island is home to a US naval communication station with a few thousand US troops and international support staff. Almost as soon as it was built, it was used to support Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. More recently, the base was central to the Persian Gulf War, the launching of airstrikes against targets in Afghanistan in 2001, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, provided a site for the detention of individuals suspected of terror offences, and as a transit point for rendition flights of terrorism suspects to countries where they were at risk of torture or ill treatment. And as recently as 2021, the military base was used to launch aircraft bombers to target Iranian-backed targets inside Iraq. Now, from around 1998, you had a series of legal cases, both in the US, but also in the UK, though it's going to be the latter that is only of interest to us, in which the Chagosians have tried to fight for their right to return to their homeland. And bar one case, which has since been overruled with new government legislation brought in, they have all failed. Okay, so that will hopefully give you some insight into the case study. What I want to do is to hopefully offer a novel reconsideration of these horrible events. Now, there has been tons written about the subject. So why write anything more, basically? Now, in order to respond to that, I'm going to briefly summarize 4 common themes that characterize much of the legal writing of the subject, why I think that they are odd, and why I think we need to consider this set of legal case and writing. Now, the legal writing focuses on the public law judgments in the UK, which, in a nutshell, try to contest the legality of the different legal instruments which enacted the dispossession. Most disagree with the judgment, with very few agreeing with it, though on different jurisprudential grounds. Now, the first theme that characterizes this general critique is that the legal writing presumes the autonomy of public law, particularly from any discussion of material social relations or capitalism. In other words, despite these issues taking place within deeply important geopolitical contexts and social movement pressures, which interestingly the legal judgments recognize as such, the scholarly commentary presupposes they largely had no structuring effect on what they largely agree as a negative outcome of the case. The problem with the legal judgments, according to these writers, is that trying to recognize the alleged legality of the dispossession, they were wrong because of some defect in the court's legal reasoning, rather than any meaningful consideration of the wider geopolitical and economic ecologies. What these interventions are absent in, therefore, is a recognition of the degree of mutuality between UK public law and material social relations, specifically the structural effects of a global capital. The second theme is that the writings largely equate dispossession and imperialism with fortifying US military power in the region. So this is the strategic islands concept. So the military base was effectively built to strengthen, buttress US naval power in the Indian Ocean region. Now, there's something arguably unusual in this rendering of the Chagosians' dispossession as merely the convergence of realpolitik between two imperial powers, albeit one waxing and the other waning. Maxins Wood, for example, writes how the UK was a progenitor of capitalist imperialism, or in other words, imperialism was, to put it in general terms, the expansion of capital accumulation. There are, of course, variations in this theory, which I can't go into detail here. Imperial dispossession, therefore, is not just about alien rule of distant territories, but the universalization of the commodity form, or capitalism, or surplus value extraction from the peripheries to the core. The absence is compounded by the fact that many of the legal judgments, as I mentioned, go into deep detail of the geopolitical milieus in which the facts of the cases were situated, where laws were made in direct response to certain political events, where feasibility studies spoke to the economics and possibility of resettlement, etc., etc. And yet it is striking, I think, but perhaps not surprising, that any discussion of the effect of material social relations of capitalism are largely absent from any of the legal literature or judgments. The third is that race is primarily understood as a justificatory discourse deployed by the UK government to rationalise the dispossession. And by implication, it presumes that race is this biological or cultural category or essence. However, as Keenan Malik writes, quote, racial differentiation emerges out of real social and economic mechanisms, end quote. In other words, race is a material relation rather than merely a biological categorization of humanity. And I'll come back to this shortly. Finally, much of the writing has a parochial focus on the UK and the UK Chagos Archipelago, a methodological nationalism that precludes the exploration of the effects, impact, and material relations of UK public law and this dispossession beyond the territory of the UK. But as we know, the dispossession included Mauritius in terms of the excision of the Chagos Archipelago from the former colony of Mauritius, and it was also the place to which the dispossessed Chagosians ended up. And so, at the very least, in order to understand the effects of this legally enacted dispossession, our scales of public law need to go beyond just the UK and the Chagos, and as I will later explain further. This paper, therefore, offers a corrective to these four common themes. It describes what happened in the Chagos Archipelago as a form of constitutional robbery, which I'll define shortly. Prior to defining this term, however, we must reformulate the theories that underpin those four common themes aforementioned. This paper, therefore, opts for what it calls a relational geography of a materialist public law. It draws on a rich texture of heterodox Marxist and materialist engagements with law, dispossession, imperialism, and race, as well as to borrow generously from the work on relational geographies in reconceptualizing the scales of UK public law. So the first, drawing off the work of Nikos Poulantzas, argues that the law is only relatively autonomous of its material social relations. Now, this is not to say that there is a linear causality between the logics and imperative of capitalist dispossession and the outcome of the legal case, but that while legal and juridical sciences have an internally coherent system of reasoning that conform to the specific formal characteristics of the modern legal systems, namely calculation, anticipation, and stability, the overall structure of society, including law, is determined in the last instance by the economic level. The second, drawing off of heterodox Marxist theories of dispossession, reframes what happened in the Chagos not just about strengthening military power in the region, but enacting what the role of exploring what the role of land dispossession is within capitalism, to quote Michael Levian in what he calls regimes of dispossession. As a departure from Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, Levian also explores the political nature of dispossession, rather than as an inevitable response to the problem of overaccumulation. I offer, however, a stretched conceptualization of Levian's theory in which A, I recognize the spatio-temporal lag between the initial dispossession or enclosure and subsequent later accumulation, and B, the racializing elements of primitive accumulation. In particular, I specifically claim that the creation of the military base was to build infrastructure, much like the roads and railways were built in colonial India, for US and UK accumulation in Iraq, or what I refer to as systematic colonization. Now, the term systematic colonization is adopted by Edward Gibbons Wakefield, and it's rooted in the idea of wasteland or waste countries, which are in need of improvement. Marx understood that the great secret of systematic colonization is the use of political and legal power to manufacture wage laborers through primitive accumulation. My argument then is that the dispossession of the Chagos was enacted to build infrastructure, here a military base on Diego Garcia, for the later accumulation or systematic colonization of Iraq. The third corrective is that I reframe race not as a biological or cultural essence, but as a material social relation. So whilst much of the legal literature literature's discussion of race in the Chagos litigation as discursive is interesting, they ignore where these processes of racialization come from. In the absence of this, they presuppose or imply race, as I said, as biological or a cultural category. However, as stated earlier, racial differentiation emerges out of real social and economic mechanisms. This paper, therefore, also explores the connections between racialization and displaceability, locating this dyad within the broader totality of capital accumulation, and offers an understanding of race that is material in two specific ways. The first is to examine how regimes of dispossession are racialized. The second explores how race is co-constitutive of class positionality, in particular, focusing on how Chagosians' racialization as Tikrio connects their racialized dispossessed status with their class status and access to work and social provisions in Mauritius. Finally, I adopt a relational geography to public law. So the traces of effects of British state power are not only felt in the Chagos, but beyond, including, as I've argued, Mauritius and Iraq. Now, this requires a reframing of the scales of public law. The paper, therefore, advances a relational geography of a materialist public law that focuses not just on the application of UK public law powers domestically, but their application of and effects globally, as well as the effects of global capital accumulation on UK public law. And so oddly, I'm going to end this presentation with the thesis of this paper, refining the four common themes and the claims that the dispossession was purely about strengthening US naval power in the region. So I argue that the dispossession of the Chagos Archipelago was an example of constitutional robbery. This term describes the contingent juridico-political technologies of regimes of dispossession that make way for the building of infrastructure for future capital accumulation. Specifically in this context, land was enclosed to construct a military base that would later be key to the systematic colonization of Iraq. These juridico-political technologies of constitutional robbery use an assemblage of different legal techniques, e.g. excision, repurposing, bordering, expulsion, and consolidation, through different institutions, executive and judicial power, to enact regimes of dispossession. Further, constitutional robbery also describes how techniques of UK public law in regimes of dispossession are racializing, specifically as a process that not only prefigures the displaceability of the Chagosians, but also constitutes the class positionality of the Chagosians in Mauritius as Cypriot. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know if anyone's got any comments or questions.
Gabby, I don't know if you want me to moderate the questions. Yeah, okay. So do we have any questions for Tanzil? If not, I'll start.
I think Ozge and somebody else raised their hand. 2-3 people raised their hand.
Oh, no, Ozge didn't.
I applauded.
I'm happy to take the applause and no questions, to be honest.
Of course.
I cannot see who has raised the hand actually, but whoever has done so is welcome to, and we have Oscar uploading. But whoever has a question is welcome to unmute and ask away.
Tanzil, could I ask what the current status, their current status is legally in terms of international law? Like, where is in the issue of, for example, recognition, where do they fall in the spectrum?
Yeah, so there was a recent judgment by the International Court of Justice, which declared that the initial decolonization of Mauritius, in which the British government basically cut off the Chagos Archipelago, was actually unlawful. And it called on the British government to address this. Now, of course, judgments by the ICJ are advisory; they're not binding for that to happen. And just as a qualification, I'm not an international lawyer, so this is being recorded. So if I made any mistakes, I apologise in advance. For that to be binding, it'd have to be approved by the UN Security Council resolution, a UN Security Council resolution. Including the permanent members, which is not going to happen because the UK is one of those permanent members. It has been approved by the General Assembly, which arguably has more political authority because there's more members in the General Assembly. There was also another domestic legal case in the British courts, which addressed the questions of a decision by the UK government not to consider resettlement, to look at the application of the European Convention of Human Rights to the Chagos Archipelago, and to also look at this decision by the ICJ. In a nutshell, because this was only decided last year, they said that the British government there was no requirement for them to reconsider resettlement, and that the decision by the International Court of Justice didn't directly affect the Chagosians' claim of resettlement, because it had to do with a different legal question regarding decolonization of Mauritius. Now, I actually recently emailed a couple of the barristers that represent two of the applicants to see whether or not the recent domestic case is being appealed to the UK Supreme Court, because it was heard in the Court of Appeal, or it might be in the High Court, and whether or not it's going to be subsequently appealed. And I've yet to receive a response. But what's also important alongside this kind of legal struggle is that there has been a political struggle with the Chagosians, also with a lot of left-wing movements in Mauritius, and also with the Chagosian diaspora in the UK. And Laura Jeffrey, who's an ethnographer, I think at the University of Edinburgh, writes particularly on the kind of social movements of the Chagosians in quite a lot of detail.
Thank you so much, Tanzil. We have a question from Gabriela, and then we'll hear from Lais.
Okay, so thank you, Tanzil. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation and getting to know a little bit more about your work. I have two questions. One is more like about the context. So is there any public discussion at the UK about, what's happening at Chagos and, all this public dispossession understanding of it? And I mean, I ask this question because you make a strong point about understanding race as a material thing and as a material sort of like relationship. And I can agree with that, but I also think there are maybe symbolic or cultural consequences from that, and like from having this strategic, like this material relationship, and also the other way around, there are symbolic sort of like ideas that actually frame this material relation. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about it, if that makes sense, or if that you find it relevant in any way. And that's why, I mean, I was asking about public discussions on that, and how that appears either like to the British and to Chagos people. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that question? I don't mind taking Lais's question as well.
Actually, yeah, because I think it would be good because it's more or less like related. It was also about the racialization process and how it was used as. So if I understood it correctly, so the idea of race was used for justifying that Chagos people actually belonged to Mauritius. That's what happened.
Yeah, carry on. No, go on.
Okay. Because that's a little what I understood, and I was curious because this idea of race as a biological category, for me, it sounds like very 19th century. It sounds like really. I was just curious to understand how did they justify using race as a biological category in the late 20th or earlier 21st century, and if they tried to use some literature or some theory to base this idea, this racialization, or if it's just like they assumed that was how it is, and that's it. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you both for those questions. So in terms of whether or not there's any public discussion of the Chagos, very little. As I said, there's a small diaspora population of Chagosians in Crawley, and also it's one that registers on the kind of political radars of the Mauritian diaspora as well, because it's very much connected to domestic politics there. But there's also an all-party parliamentary group in the House of Parliament in the UK that was headed by Jeremy Corbyn, but I don't know who was a former Labour leader, but I don't know who currently leads it. There was a fairly popular documentary that was doing the rounds that was made a couple of decades ago by John Pilger, the Australian journalist, but it's a fairly unknown example of heinous and fairly egregious dispossession, even among human rights activists, the left, etc., etc. So on the question of race as material, race as symbolic, cultural, and trying to understand where the deployment of race as a biological category came from, I'll try to answer all of those things. So, I mean, a lot of the legal literature doesn't overtly explicitly state that race is a biological or cultural category. I think that they tacitly accept that the Chagosians are this race of people, and therefore that's the reason that they're treated differently, rather than understanding that it's through their differential treatment that they are racialized. So it's not this kind of linear causality, and I think that race is a reason they're dispossessed, and I think that linear causality can infer that race is this kind of biological or cultural essence. And without kind of going into detail, if you look a lot of the government archives, the way that a lot of the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office talked about the Chagosians, and I use a quote from Dennis Greenhill, who's actually a lawmaker now. He's a peer in the House of Lords. The way that they talked about them were these, you know, savages, barbarians, that were therefore disposable. That's the thing that prefigured their displaceability. No one would care about them. But there's also interesting elements in which the kind of material reality is also constitutive of their racialization. So one of them is the fact that they are formerly enslaved and indentured people, that's something that lends to this idea that they are precarious, that they're precarious or temporary labourers. So their race and class can't be easily cleaved. They're something that are understood as the same. And because they're temporary labourers, because they are that very precarity prefigures their displaceability. It means because they're not attached to the land, because they are enslaved people that were brought over here, or they're temporary contract laborers that were brought over from Mauritius, that they were able to be displaced. I go into this in a little bit of detail in the paper, but it may be that I don't go into it in inadequate enough detail, and it's something that I need to kind of go and revisit. So I do, I really, really welcome the questions. One thing that I would say, which is quite interesting, that two legal scholars wrote about, which I think is an interesting comparison, is the way in which the British government dealt with the Chagosians, which was one overseas territory under British sovereignty, and the Falkland Islands, which is another British overseas territory. And round about the time that the Chagosians, who were racialized in one particular way, were fighting for their right to be resettled because they had been expelled from their lands. A couple of years later, the Falkland Islands, which is obviously racialized as white, they're white settlers. The British government, what did they do when Argentina intervened? They sent over troops to defend that overseas territory. Okay, huge disparity in the way in which the British government have dealt with those two different overseas territories. And not only that, the legal arrangement of the British overseas territory and the Falkland Islands were initially very, very similar. But what ended up happening is the British government gave loads of power of self-government to the Falkland Islands, whereas with the Chagos Archipelago, it was effectively governed as a distant colony with no level of self-government.
Can I just follow up on that? So
yeah.
are the Chagosians now claiming for independence and resettlement, right? Is that right?
So this is a really interesting question, one that Laura Jeffrey takes up, because the claim is the Chagos Archipelago, because the Chagos has never been a country, right? It was formerly part of the colony of Mauritius, and this is one of the questions which riddles all kind of anti-colonial theory, when colonies have become independent, they're not, as much as some post-colonial theorists may argue, they're not trying to go back to this kind of mythological past, because the nation state is only a fairly new a political construct. So the argument has been whether or not the Chagosians want independence, including from Mauritius, or whether or not they want it to be incorporated back into Mauritius. And so there is some antagonisms between the Mauritian left, who have been fighting alongside the Chagosians, and the Chagosians themselves. Interestingly, you may have read it, but a couple of months ago in the news, the Chagosians, often what they would do is organize visits back to their homelands, but they would always be supervised by the British. And a couple of months ago, they did their first visit without any British supervision. So it was quite historic. But one of the interesting things that they did is when they went, is that they planted the Mauritian flag rather than any kind of a new Chagosian flag. So maybe that is some indication of how the Chagosians see their anti-colonial independence struggle as part of Mauritius rather than as an independent country in and of itself.
Tanzil, I have a question about relational geographies of public law that you mentioned.
Yeah.
How would that imply rethinking the scale at which legal instruments are framed in practice? And if so, what would this imply not only for the particular context of the Chagos Archipelago, but also how would this support other decolonization processes in other contexts?
Okay, so that's a really, really great question. So when we're thinking about reimagining the scales of public law, what I'm not just interested in is what the effects of British state power are, okay? So and when we think about the geographies of UK public law, we tend to reasonably think that they only apply to the territory of the UK, okay? Because it's UK public law, so it's only going to apply to the territory of the UK. But if we look at the UK public law jurisprudence, we see that there are instabilities in thinking that UK public law only applies or has effects within the territory of UK law. One good example is the extraterritoriality of the Human Rights Act. Now, the Human Rights Act basically gives effect to the European Convention of Human Rights. But in a case called Alskany, what the UK Supreme Court said is that human rights obligations also follow British soldiers in territory that's under the effective control of the British, in this case, Iraq. So we're not talking about the UK here, we're talking about a different territory where British state power applies. So that one simple example destabilizes this idea that the geographies of public law should only apply to the UK. And there's a myriad of other examples that I go into in the paper. But the other reason why I think that we need to reevaluate these scales or geographies of UK public law is not just looking at the effects of British state power, but looking at wider geopolitical ecologies and their effects on UK public law, right? So UK public law is not this thing that transcends global politics, economics, history, culture, but has a much more complicated constituted by and constitutive of relationship with. And this is something that a lot of the materialist constitutionalists, a lot of post-colonial scholars that wrote on constitutionalism have been thinking about. But we as kind of legal scholars, particularly in public law, which is very, very doctrinal and very black letter, have perhaps been ignorant of. In terms of how this informs wider anti-colonial struggle, I have to sit and think about that for a little bit. I don't want to give a haphazard answer, but it's a really good question that I want to kind of think about more. And if I can think of something, I'll let you know in the future. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions?
Okay, then. So thank you so much for your brilliant questions and interventions. I'm going to now hand it over to my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Loan Diep. Now, Dr. Loan Diep is a postdoctoral fellow working on nature-based solutions in cities with the Urban Systems Lab here at the New School. Her background is in urban and environmental geography. Her work focuses on justice in urban developments in cities of the Global South, principally on water justice in informal settlements. She graduated from a PhD from University College of London on the challenges of green infrastructure in the context of favelas in Sao Paulo in Brazil, which she is going to now be presenting. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Tanzil. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully the right screen. Yes. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I will talk to you about my PhD research on the politics of green infrastructure in the city of Sao Paulo, as Tanzil said, which my PhD research, which I completed last year. So if any of you, Gabi, tell me.
It's not full screen. If you want it full screen right now.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right. So if you are familiar with urban greening, I realize this is a very different topic from the one we were discussing before, but if you are familiar with urban greening, you might have heard of concepts like green infrastructure, but also ecosystem services, ecosystem-based adaptation, and more recently, the concept of nature-based solutions. Here, I frame nature-based urbanism as the development and planning approach that encompasses all these concepts in the context of cities. So in this short presentation, I'm going to critically discuss nature-based urbanism in the context of informal settlements, more commonly known as favelas in Brazil. Nature-based urbanism here refers to the urban development approach of working with nature. simple terms, which contradicts with, contrast with the notion of working against nature, meaning controlling the forces of nature. So nature-based urbanism involves, for example, incorporating ecological components into the built environment in cities. So nature-based urbanism approaches like nature-based solutions, they provide a vision to preserve, restore, or manage ecosystems to address societal challenges and provide further benefits to humans and to nature itself. So the picture on the right shows some different examples of the types of nature-based solutions you can have in cities. So when I talk about societal challenges, this includes addressing the impacts of climate change. River ecosystems, for example, which I'm going to expand on later, are very important ecosystems since they are part of the hydrological cycle, and they play an important role during flood events. And protecting river margins, meaning that you expand the ecosystems that protect rivers and support the cycle. Protecting these margins means that you can mitigate flood events, but also you can provide further benefits, such as providing recreational spaces for people. And so that's a form of nature-based solutions, but other examples can include protecting or restoring forests, urban parks, or wetlands. And in cities, these solutions are very important, notably because cities concentrate a large part of the world's population. Currently, we have 4.2 billion of people living in cities, and by 2050, 2/3 of the global population will be living in urban areas. 90% of this increase will actually occur in regions of Asia and Africa. And the important thing is cities are very vulnerable to climate change because they host a large part of the population. And one of the reasons why they are vulnerable as well is because when they grow, they tend to lose the vegetation cover to make space for the built environment. And this vegetation cover is a natural barrier to climate impacts. So nature-based solutions in cities are very relevant because they can help preserve or expand green areas and thereby protect a huge part of the population. The interesting thing as well about NBS and nature-based solutions is that it intends to provide what we call holistic approaches and to tackle various issues. So it does not only argue that we need to protect nature for people, but also for the sake of nature itself. And this at minimum cost, if you compare to more traditional forms of development with what we call gray infrastructure, for example, the hard infrastructure. And so proponents to NBS, nature-based solutions, argue that this can create win-wins or even triple wins, meaning that we can tackle the social, the environmental, and the economic objectives all at once. So I've talked about nature-based solutions, nature-based urbanism being done through the application of the concept of nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, etc. So very briefly, there is also a hierarchy among these terms, although this is debated. But you can consider that green infrastructure is a form of nature-based solutions and linear parks are a form of green infrastructure. So the picture here, the pictures show a very famous example of linear park project in Seoul, in South Korea, of the Chagos River being restored through a linear park. So an example of a green infrastructure. Now, these concepts have become increasingly trendy over the past few years, and nature-based solution is currently the most popular term. It has attracted a lot of attention since it emerged in 2012. The new IPCC report that was released a month ago has dedicated a lot of space to nature-based solutions. The World Economic Forum released a report earlier this year in January, and it tackles a lot of nature-based solutions as well. 2 weeks ago, the White House launched an executive order to have a national assessment of nature, but more focused on forests, and doing this through nature-based solutions. But a growing body of scholars have demonstrated that there is a need to be careful about NBS and similar concepts in terms of the way they are conceptualized and applied in practice. And researchers like me, we like to question this notion of co-benefits. Can we ever meet everyone's needs in urban development? Problematizing nature-based urbanism is particularly important, considering the way these concepts they have emerged and expanded in the global north, which raises the question of relevance in different socioeconomic contexts and notably in the so-called Global South. So my research has aimed at problematizing nature-based urbanism by complexifying what it means in practice and arguing it cannot inherently lead to ecologically sustainable and socially just outcomes because the world is complex and these solutions are not magic solutions. They take place in complex arrangements of layered socio-political dynamics. So if green infrastructure, nature-based solutions and other nature-based urbanism concepts provide co-benefits to people and nature, what would it look like in a place like this? So I asked my thesis, to what extent does green infrastructure help achieve environmental justice in the context of urban informality? So I focused on green infrastructure because I'm particularly interested in the tensions that emerge from the presence or the absence of infrastructure to make space for nature. And I have worked with environmental justice theories along with political ecology theories to help me build a framework that looks at the distribution of goods and bads that results from environmental interventions and what this means in terms of power in the practice of green infrastructure. Yeah, there you go. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but it's just for people interested in doing a PhD or who are currently doing a PhD to see what this could look like in my field in the UK. The reason why I put this here is to mention that I adopted a mixed method approach, particularly when I did my fieldwork in Sao Paulo. I conducted transit walks, household service, focus group discussions, and key informal interviews in 2 favelas of Sao Paulo. And today I'll just focus on one of them, and that is the favela of Sapé, which was looking like this before the project was implemented in 2006. As you can see, we have a very dense environment with a river passing through, highly polluted with solid waste and sewage, and flooding every now and then and causing a lot of damage, including the loss of lives. And despite this, you can see on the right picture, people have built houses on top of its margins, and there is a house that was literally built over the river. So green infrastructure makes sense in several ways in such context, because it can help address issues like floods, but also provide further benefits in the way it could provide a corridor for mobility for people to walk or cycle along the river, and to help valorize the neighborhood altogether from a socioeconomic perspective. But you see where I'm getting at. There are complications in growing areas like this. So much density in the built environment reflects conflicts over land. And that means that there is little space to implement a green project without raising some conflicts. But it's not only a technical problem. Interventions like this, they raise a very complex question around the notion of informality. So generally, any form of governmental intervention in informal settlements has political implications. A governmental intervention can be politically associated to the legitimization of the occupation of people on land that is disputed. And we also know that urban greening can lead to many serious consequences in relation to ecological gentrification, but also imply evictions. And that's very important in the context of green infrastructure projects, which claim that they provide social benefits, because in a context like Sapé, in here, where houses are built on river margins, river restorations means removing these houses. So many questions that emerge if you want to apply a green infrastructure, if you want to apply the concept and implement a green infrastructure project here. So now what happened with this project in this specific place? There have been very interesting approaches adopted by the municipality along with other governmental bodies. And first of all, what I want to say is that we need to recognize that these approaches show an effort in adopting a holistic approach. The first aim was to restore the ecological health of the river, but we knew that this implied tackling pollution issues. Just cleaning the river at once doesn't restore the ecological health. We need to think about how this works over the long term. So solid waste that you see on the image had to be removed, but they had to think about a longer term action for that. But also in terms of sewage being discharged directly into the river by the houses being built along the margin. So for sewage to stop being discharged into the river, they had to connect people's toilets to the municipal sewers. But for this, you need to operate in a legal environment, meaning that it doesn't work with informal houses from a legal perspective. So what happens in general in other contexts is that you evict people to make space for the river and resolve the sanitation issues all at once. But there, the municipality decided to destroy the houses built along the margin, but in parallel, they build new buildings to relocate evicted households in situ. And there they could legally build a sanitation system and stop sewage pollution. So we have one, people could have new houses in situ. Two, the river margins could be restored, meaning the vegetation cover could be retrieved and help address flood risks. And three, there was, that would mean theoretically no more sewage, meaning the water quality could be improved. So there was a real effort through a cross-sectoral collaboration to make this happen in a way that would really benefit the local population over the long term. At least this was the plan, and this is what happened in reality. Houses were removed along the margins, green infrastructure was built as a form of a linear park to restore the river margins, although this is with limited vegetation, and new buildings were built to accommodate the population. But the successful aspect of this project has been very limited. Pollution issues in the river quickly restarted. The government and people have, well, the government and other experts, let's say, have blamed newcomers and new invaders who build houses with new informal sanitation connections. And the disposal of solid waste has continued, and this has raised issues around the way waste management and the maintenance of the riverscape altogether is being done, and who is responsible for it. So very importantly, the housing plan was never completed, meaning that many families, we're talking about several hundreds, have been waiting to be relocated for about 15 years without proper compensation. So now when we're asking the community what they think, the majority says, okay, it was great at first, the river was healthy, the renovated space was aesthetically pleasing, the housing project was promising. But when various issues appeared, including that of pollution and informal housing, and the conflicts that emerged from this, people realized it would have perhaps been much better to bury the river. So over half of the population I interviewed said that the river needed a whole new project, even just after years of, just a few years after completion of this project, which had cost several million. And among this, over half want to bury the river under concrete. And so this opens many questions about the way green infrastructure works in informal settlements. People say it would be great, but if there was proper maintenance, I would be willing to help maintain the place. It would be ideal, but it won't work here. The population won't preserve it. So I'm just going to reflect a little bit on these discourses. This is a discourse that is circulated by not only by the government, but also by people themselves, but and academic experts, which I consider a blaming discourse at once when we say people do not worry about the environment, people lack education to understand these issues, they do not appreciate the project. And these are important to deconstruct, because from a political ecology perspective, this discourse can be framed as being harmful because they put a responsibility of the project failure on communities instead of talking about political layers involved, including in recognizing that the project approach was perhaps not adapted to the local conditions. So I'm giving an example here of the state water and sanitation utility of São Paulo, saying there has been a depollution of the street with implementation of infrastructure. So if there is any pollution now, it's because of the invaders who came after project completion, basically saying we have done our job. Now the issue has been that people have not behaved. They have not been the good citizens. So do people in favela really not care about the environment? Well, there is definitely evidence for counter-arguments. And just this picture on the right shows that there are many community gardens that have been built and taken care of through residents' initiatives. But the government has built this new project, the Linear Park, through what we can be qualified as a top-down approach, instead of integrating green infrastructure projects into such existing initiatives. So I'm going to stop here saying this is where we are. the quest for triple wins through nature-based urbanism continues. This example does not mean that green infrastructure are not adequate to the context of informal settlements, but rather that it highlights that differentiated approaches are needed for complex contexts like this. And this should involve a strong collaboration of different actors with communities to plan and implement green infrastructure together. And only then nature-based solution, nature-based urbanism will become a democratic project. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
Well, I don't know if I can start. Gabi, can I start?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the noise. They are fixing the leak in the ceiling. Loan and Tanzil, I'm really happy to share you all this morning. I have a lot of questions to Tanzil, to no one, but actually I will, at this moment, make a question for Loan. It was really, really interesting, Loan. My question actually has already been answered for you, but I really wanna ask something related to the fieldwork in São Paulo, especially about the interviews and the focus group that you said in your presentation. For example, if in the interviews or in the working group, the key informants, if they themselves pointed out the needs of the community, and if its nature-based solutions was made in dialogue with the needs of this community. I know in your presentation, you just conclude as nature-based urbanism must be democratic. So I just want to understand why this doesn't happen. And about the interviews, about the needs of the community and how these needs are translated in action, in a nature-based action. That's it. But amazing presentations. I'm really happy.
Thank you, Janaina. Okay, so the way I designed and field work with the different data collection tools was precisely to hear different perspectives. In my thesis, I wanted to have a chapter dedicated to the way communities were seeing the project and the perceptions towards green infrastructure, but I also obviously wanted to hear the perspective of different governmental bodies that were involved, and also that of academics, because academics who in Brazil, as you know very well, often have these double hats of working as consultants, but also in research. So I was interested in hearing, for example, the position of the architects and urban planners who had been involved, because they reflect a lot on all these questions that you have raised. So, of course, many of them understand that it is complex to do nature-based solutions in communities. Everyone acknowledge that this is something that requires time and requires participatory approach. The reason why I worked in Brazil actually was because I was very interested in the way the institutional approaches around participation happen. And I have to acknowledge that there have been huge efforts in including people in the project. The other favela where I worked, Robbery, which is right next to Sapé, and the project is quite similar in a way, but it has a huge difference in the way they conducted the participatory approach. In Sapé, you can really see it was a top-down process where people were presented the design that they thought was needed. And that's very important to say also that there had been an assessment being done pre-project few years before to understand what people wanted in terms of design of the Linear Park. And people had said, we want to bury people. So cannot say that the government didn't know that they wanted to, communities wanted to bury the river, but because obviously this contradicts with the notion of green infrastructure to restore a river. If you bury a river, you completely lose all the ecosystems. They park this and just ignore it and say people do not understand. And that's what I'm trying to show. It is not that people do not understand that ecological issues are important. There are many layers to unpack here. And most importantly, it is not about the design itself. It's not a question of opening or closing the river. It's about at least two more things. And one is the way this engagement was done of the population. Obviously, the population felt very frustrated that they had been asked what they wanted, but this was clearly ignored. And even though there had been dialogue during many meetings, the management council that was formed specifically for the project, because the project has lasted for so long, and you know how local politics are, you have a big rotation of who is in charge, and communities in informal settlements, they evolve very quickly. So all these things, all this dynamic over a long-term period meant there has been a lot of confusion and people ended up being frustrated. And so one of the reasons why I think the people wanted to bury the river is just because they were like, we want to be done with that. And these are not the kind of things that governments necessarily acknowledge. They prefer flattening the discourses or the different layers of complexity by saying it's just that it's impossible, there, it's too complicated. I don't think we should give up on the concept. I think we should explore it, but the governance issue that this raises is maybe green infrastructure can be done differently. We work with very top-down approaches, but green infrastructure can be democratized, the nature-based urbanism in general, if we rethink the way we can take opportunities, because it's a concept that is very flexible, which is also a problem in itself, and that's another question. But the fact you can implement it at different scale means that you can very work with small spaces. And what I try to show in the end with the project that people have been doing with community gardens is that maybe we can rethink about green infrastructure being integrated within existing projects. It is complicated, but if you grasp the energy that communities have already, because many people do many things, it's just that this project comes on top of everything, and they just say, this is how we're going to do it, and it's good for you, just believe it. But no, maybe we democratizing nature-based urbanism means taking what's already going on and supporting it and integrated on top of that this vision of greening the area. And it doesn't have to be all green. We also think about hybrid approaches where you have a mix of gray and green infrastructure. I hope this answers the question.
Can I follow on that? I mean, I have part of my question was already answered, but so I have two follow-up questions. One is, as you were saying, there is a very complicated relationship between experts and the citizens in these situations, and also a very difficult relationship between government and government agents and the citizens. So I was wondering, how do you see that? Like, how do you see a good relationship being built in these framings? Because I mean, when you think about turning something democratic, you have to think that you're turning something somehow a conflict. I mean, there are different interests that will be like put there. Like from, if we must say, in groups in these situations, from citizens, from the government and the experts, they are probably think that the best is different. And democracy is not so much about consensus in these situations. It might be a lot more about compromising and how. So how would you see that as a good relationship? And like following up on that also, did you experience differences in power relations within the communities? Like I'm thinking about local brokers that may, represent the groups and maybe frame their needs in ways that might not be exactly what the citizens or the community needs, but what they actually see as, I don't know, the best for their own careers or the groups they're representing, or even, I mean, in Brazil, local brokers are generally related to like local councils,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're working for the vereadores, for example, in many situations. So they're sometimes putting forward like other people's projects also. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the things I wanted to raise when I was looking at discourses towards the end was that precisely this kind of mainstream narrative that communities do not understand. I mean, it's problematic in many ways. And one of them is because it just creates a homogeneous entity. You know, it portrays communities as a homogeneous entity, completely losing all the nuances, including internal dynamics, which are between the population and nature. And even that within nature, we need to be careful about where we qualify as nature, because rivers in these particular communities is not considered really as river, and also internal politics. And one thing that these discourses do is that they fuel conflicts. Something I've been trying to think about is the idea that by portraying communities as the bad citizens has obviously repercussions within communities, because there are different layers. These communities are very heterogeneous in socioeconomic aspects. And you can see that some people completely distinguish themselves from another part, the newcomers, the poorest. Something that I didn't expand on is that you have many types of households in a very small place. You have the brick type of house, as you know, in favelas, but you also have the shacks with wood building on the river. And they're just, you know, within a few meters of each other. But people like, no, these guys, they are different from us. They are those who are causing all the trouble, you know. And so by using these discourses, which create conflicts within the communities. And what I think is an issue is that this impedes community cohesion, which is pretty much what would be needed for them to negotiate a project that would actually work and negotiate them during these management councils with all the big guys, the utility and the different parts of the government and the private actors who are involved as well. And when I was mentioning to Janaina earlier with the Agua Podre project, is that this is something that they have done very well. Even though the project was never implemented, they have organized and they have been doing that for so many years now. I can't remember how many, but they have created this little committee of residents who are really pushing for the project to happen, and having this strong cohesion in the community has enabled them to legitimize their requests and to raise the voice in a very clear and loud way. But as you said, it's very true that there are layers within the communities to consider. With this other project, the Agua Podre, you can definitely argue that this is not necessarily a representation of everyone's needs. I have, even during the pandemic, I was attending sometimes some of the meetings they were doing with the municipality online, and you can see that you have still like many, you have some requests that conflict with each other within the community, and it's normal. I mean, we do not want to just make one request. We need to unpack all these nuances, right? But the way the management council work is that you only have some representatives of communities, and they are elected communities, but in SAPE, it was clear from the beginning that there were contestations of who these were. There were several, and again, they were supposedly elected, but you could tell that a huge part of the population was not represented by them.
Thank you, Lauren, for a really illuminating presentation. It was a pleasure to learn more about the things that you're working on, and also just to see the kind of, you know, real effects and materialization of your work as well. So forgive me, this isn't like a properly formed or coherent question. And there's two questions, but the second one is contingent on the answer to the first. Forgive me, I think I might have missed out, but in terms of the interventions in these nature-based solutions, is it just the state, or are there private stakeholders who are also involved in the nature-based solutions? So that's my first question.
Okay. Do you want to ask the other one as well?
It's partly contingent on what your response is. So.
It's yes, so I mean, there have been a lot of people involved, public, private, civil society, NGOs. Although for this case, NGOs are usually much less, but it is truly a cross-sectoral collaboration and a multi-stakeholder collaboration, because you have different levels of governance involved. You have the state, and you have the municipality, and you have the local government, and you have the civil society, and in all of that, you have the private sector. You have contracted consultants, which were the ones who designed the project. Obviously, the money comes from different private funds as well. But the municipality was the one leading, but within the municipality, you have many organs. And because the project has lasted for so long, and many changes in the municipal governance occurred, it was very hard for me to track who has done what, because some of these departments have disappeared, and some people would disagree on who was actually leading, and because there were different components of the project as well, and they were called differently, there were different phases, all of this gets very complicated. And that's why São Paulo is so interesting, because it's supposedly a city in a global south country, but this is something that needs to be argued, because its governance structure, for example, is quite complex and quite sophisticated, as we can say. It's just that nature-based urbanism needs to mature more within this kind of context, because even if it's sophisticated and complex, it means it's also fragmented. You want cross-sectoral collaboration, but I think, things got lost along the way. Funds were, it's very hard to track where funds went, actually, and this shows the complexity of how nature-based solutions occurs in practice from a governance perspective.
Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, and so I guess the next question is about whether or not nature-based solutions offer opportunities for these different, I don't like to use this word, but I'll just use it just because I can't think of anything else, the different kind of stakeholders that are involved. So, you talked about the limits of the top-down approach by the state, whether that's at the kind of more federal level or at the municipal level. Is there a danger of private sector involvement using nature-based solutions as an opportunity for neoliberal development, because the obviously kind of private sector capital has a particular relationship to this thing that we call nature. Is that a thing? Is it an anxiety that the kind of local community, recognizing how homogenous that local community is, that they have? And then the other thing, and maybe this speaks a little bit to the question that Gabby was asking, is that these projects seem to be very localized. Does the scale of the project provide the potential for a much more kind of radical and kind of democratic response, because they're responding to the needs and aspirations and the lives of people that are there, rather than, it seems as if this provides an opening for a kind of radical democratic settlement. The potentials of it go beyond the nature-based solutions and whatnot. So that's
great questions. For the first one, we need to go back a bit in history. So water governance, if any of you are familiar, has a very rich history of fluctuating between different types of governance structures. So let's see that post-war, the water governance was we started to think about whether the state should lead the way we manage water resources. And in many countries, this didn't work because the states sometimes didn't have the finance or didn't have the expertise, which is why this led us to think about the private sector, possibly better manage water resources because they would have the fund and the incentives, and this led to all the neoliberal processes, which we know have then led to the community-led type of governance that people have been asking for. In Latin America, there are many interesting cases that need to be mentioned. And after that, when we know this was this led afterwards to what we call the co-production aspects of water management, where the state and people manage together water resources. And so green infrastructure, nature-based urbanism in a way aligns with this notion of involving many stakeholders and trying to find consensus. And I don't see this, it is extremely complicated. It is time-consuming to do participatory processes, right? It is messy, but perhaps this is what we need. And maybe the time frame at which we are trying to do projects is what is wrong. Maybe we do need to get our hands dirty and go into this politics of understanding what people want. And obviously this is different in different contexts. Maybe here, if there was more time spent on understanding local dynamics and human-nature relationships and conflicts within the community, things would have been very different. And perhaps this means that we should have involved different types of experts. So maybe urban planners and architects, engineers were not necessarily the right expertise to design the project. Maybe we needed community mobilizers, and maybe this would have completely changed the way the project would have materialized in practice. In terms of scale, I love that question, because what really got me interested in this concept of green infrastructure is that scale really matters. So not only in terms of the scale of the project itself, the infrastructure that you implement. So I was saying earlier that you can work with very small spaces when you have a rain garden, but at the end, the idea is to connect these small spaces so you can look at a bigger scale. And when you talk about water, you think about the watershed, where the impacts of these different small interventions all together, they make sense because you work around the hydrological cycle, and this has an impact on water quality and water availability at the watershed scale. But from a political perspective as well. So there is often like this notion of thinking about ecosystems on a natural way, but also in social ways. So I think what it says is that nature-based solutions, if we work at watershed scale, you need to involve completely different type of actors, which is why some countries like France, they have committees which are very much focused on the watershed scale, and maybe more power should be given to these kind of actors rather than focusing on the municipality. Or, I mean, it's an open question, but basically, yeah, the question of scale does matter. And if we explore this further, maybe things will change radically. The complex thing here, what I'm trying to say as well, is that nature-based urbanism concept, they try to do everything at once. And because there is so much blurriness around the concept, I mean, as I said earlier, it's great to have such flexibility, but because it is so flexible, that means that the concepts have been misappropriated. So claiming here that this was a green infrastructure project can be very controversial. Why was it green infrastructure? Was it green for a start? I'm not sure. Does it actually connect at scale to the bigger picture? Possibly, because the river was chosen specifically because it's one of the affluents of the Pinheiros, which is one of the biggest rivers of São Paulo, which is a huge target for the state government in terms of its program to restore the whole ecosystem. So there is probably a need to also define more specifically what nature-based urbanism is. And I think what we are missing, there is a lot of discussion of what it is in terms of infrastructure itself, but maybe we should define a bit more what it means in terms of democratic process.
Just to come on to that, is there could you say a little bit more about the term nature-based solutions? because that sounds like it sounds like something from the kind of, you know, neoliberal lexicon, and it might not be. The idea that there's a singular problem which is divorced from, you know, background conditions which, you know, prefigure that, right? So the reason why there is, you know, problems of sanitation in these informal settlements is because of you know, certain kind of social and political economic arrangements within that society. Does nature-based solutions ignore that kind of wider political economic ecology, or is it, you know, because you're when you're talking several times throughout your presentation, you've talked about kind of connecting it to the kind of, you know, bigger picture, right? You know, having these small scale projects are really important, and they have, you know, huge social value. But does that, in your, you know, expert understanding, does that kind of does that ignore these bigger kind of political questions about, you know, why is it that the sanitation is really, really poor in these areas? Or is it something that addresses that? I'm sorry if I'm not being coherent, but like, yeah.
Well, I think I got the question, and I think there are many ways I can answer. But first of all, yes, the language of solutions, of new innovative, is definitely something that needs to be debated, and has been debated. The first thing I need to say is that green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, etc., are not new concepts. They might be new terms, but we should go back to indigenous practices of working with nature, which is something that is taking much more space now in the research on nature-based solutions. So green infrastructure, along with other terms, arguably have been mostly remaining within technical disciplines in academia and in practice as well. And that's why actually I chose green infrastructure, because I was interested in seeing how it can repoliticize the concept, and argue how technocratic approaches are highly problematic, and they have impacts on social inclusion in the way you govern nature. But what nature-based solution is doing in terms of research, at least, it's become so popular now. You have an enormous body of research going deep into these questions of how these need to be redemocratized, more inclusive, repoliticized. So there is, if you are interested, you have a huge body of research actually seeking to go deep into the political aspects of what nature-based solutions can imply in practice.
Is there any more questions? No? Well, it's already 12:30. So if we're happy, we're ending it now. Thank you all for coming and for participating. And we'll see each other on Monday, right?